ITC power reports, grid reports, as it were. And this one is very topical because I flagged, well, it was last month, in fact, that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, also known as FERC, issued Order Number 1920, and to increase the pace of transmission grid expansion and strengthen regional transmission planning. So this landmark ruling requires each of the transmission regions in the United States to undergo long-term transmission planning, and the rulemaking also contains important reforms to local transmission oversight and interregional coordination. Yeah, I know it sounds a little complicated, but to help us kind of wind our way through that, we have joining us today Nathan Benedict, who is the Director of Regulatory Strategy for ITC. Welcome, Nathan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and I'm happy to help unpack Order 1920. But to explain ITC and who I am and what I do, I'd like to take a step back and talk a little bit about our electricity grid. And the way to think about it is that it keeps the lights on in our homes and businesses, and that it consists of three parts. The first part is where electricity is generated, and this is where we take raw forms of energy like the wind and the sun, coal, natural gas, convert it to electricity. Once we've got that electricity, it hops on a highway. That highway consists of high voltage electric transmission lines. And then as we get closer to homes and businesses, that electricity hops back off onto lower voltage, smaller local power lines that we call distribution. And that's what brings the electricity directly into our houses and our places of work. ITC is the nation's largest independent electric transmission company. And by independent, what I mean is that our sole focus is on that middle part, the transmission part of the three-part system. And that's relatively unique in the industry. So unlike other companies in the industry, we're uniquely focused on just that transmission part. We own, operate, and maintain over 16,000 miles of transmission across a 90,000 square mile footprint. Because we develop, build, maintain the transmission infrastructure that holds that three-part system together, it's much like the highways do with our national network of roads. We're primarily regulated at the federal level. And as you mentioned, that's at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission level, or by FERC. And in my role as Director of Regulatory Affairs, I'm responsible for two areas. One is related to transmission policy development, all those transmission issues that come before FERC and the associated compliance that goes along with it. And then also the rates for providing transmission service, essentially how we get compensated for doing what we do.
All right. So can you summarize for the viewers and listeners here what the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission's Order 1920 is and why it's significant?
Yeah, I can do that. FERC Order 1920 is what we call a final rule. It's essentially establishing new requirements for how regional transmission grid entities are going to be evaluating transmission solutions for these long-term demands on the grid going out into the future. And Order 1920 effectively sets a floor. It's a kind of the minimum level of actions these regional grid entities must take. But Order 1920 also gives the entities some flexibility so they can do more or different activities that take that floor and do activities that are consistent with it or even superior to it. And as you know, in our role at ITC, focus on transmission, these foundational aspects of Order 1920, it's something we've been looking at and advocating for a very long time, because we've been thinking for quite a while about what our future grid needs are and how we can most effectively address those needs in a way that's cost effective for customers.
All right. So I wonder if you can provide more details on the benefits of this new rule.
Yeah, I'm happy to get into some of the nuts and bolts of it. And when I said the rule requires regional entities to look out into the future, they're required to look out over a future that's at least 20 years. So this is very much long-term planning. And they're going to study what the transmission needs are within those 20-year periods. And then every 5 years, they're going to take another study, to take another look at those 20 years out in the future. And when they do that study, they're going to look at three different scenarios. And this is kind of a wonky term, but the way to think about a scenario is that it's a diverse, reasonably probable view of what future demands on the grid will be. What will future electricity supply look like, and what will demand look like? And by evaluating multiple scenarios and looking at the transmission solutions that have value in those scenarios, we're really ensuring that customers are going to get value from whatever transmission solutions are identified in whichever future comes to pass. And in addition, those scenarios, they're going to be updated every 5 years so they don't become stale. We're going to make sure that we're using up-to-date information to inform our views of what these potential electricity supply and demand patterns are. In addition, those studies are going to look at advanced technologies. So wherever advanced technologies can be deployed to ensure that our existing transmission facilities and anything that's new is used efficiently. And that all kind of comes back to providing benefits to customers. And electric transmission really provides many benefits. Order 1920 is listing or requiring regions to look at 7 different benefits that must be considered when evaluating these new facilities. And taking, in my opinion, of course, taking a more complete view of benefits, make sure that customers are getting beneficial transmission, but it also helps with allocating the costs, because one of the questions about cost allocation is that people don't want to pay for things if they're not getting a benefit. And so if we can be clear about what those benefits are, it makes the cost allocation decision negotiation a little bit easier. And so what the rule does is it provides a pathway for stakeholders to agree on what the cost allocation will be. But if they can't, the regions are also required to have what we call an ex ante or a backstop cost allocation method on file. So to the extent there are disagreements, those disagreements don't prevent necessary transmission from moving forward. And I'll also note there's been a little bit of contention in the press and in that Order 1920 proceeding about the role that states play. And so what I'll note is that for quite some time, states have had a pivotal role in the process of planning transmission, selecting which projects are beneficial and should move forward, and to determining how to pay for transmission. And that role continues in Order 1920. Really nothing has changed. All that 1920 does is provide some specific touch points for a state to be involved along the way.
So in your view, how does this new rule benefit Michigan in particular?
Yeah, I'll get into a little bit about that because I've been talking about things from kind of the federal perspective, and then we'll narrow down to talk about Michigan. And what's interesting to note is, as I mentioned before, ITC is a developer in the MISO region and the SPP region for the regional transmission organizations. And so Order 1920 at the federal level is basically taking the success story in MISO, building on it, and then requiring that framework to be deployed across the country. And Michigan, our ITC is part of that MISO footprint. And so some of the successes in MISO have also been successes for Michigan. A good example of that are the multi-value projects. These were approved back in 2011. Now MISO is undertaking what we call long-range transmission planning. They approved 1 tranche of projects in 2022. Some of those are in Michigan. And there's another tranche slated to be approved later this year that also includes projects for Michigan. But I'll say that Michigan has benefited from MISO's approach. And a good example of this is with respect to those MVPs, or because when they were approved, MISO studied their benefits and looked at the benefits relative to costs. And at that time, the benefits were estimated at being anywhere from 1.8 to 3.0 times as big as costs. In other words, they were highly beneficial. And over time, as MISO's gone back and looked at those estimates, they've found the projects to be even more beneficial than what they first estimated. And so to me, this shows that there are really no regrets in taking a longer term holistic view at addressing our energy needs, and Michigan benefits from that. And really what we're doing is taking that success story, or FERC is taking that success story and requiring other regions to take that framework into the future. And so I'll say that the final rule really accelerates the build out of our future grid, helps us integrate renewables, and advances the transition to a cleaner, sustainable energy landscape. And that is across the country and in Michigan.
So how long has FERC been evaluating this rule, and what does it take for a concept at FERC to become a decision or a rule?
I appreciate the wonky question. I like wonky questions. So I'll talk a little bit about how FERC goes into its process. And what it does is it issues something called a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or a NOPR. And the idea here is that FERC is proposing changes, making them public, explaining the policy basis and the legal basis for making the changes, and it gives stakeholders the opportunity to comment on those changes. And when they do, FERC can take that feedback and inform ultimately what the final rule becomes. And in the case of Order 1920, The NOPR that preceded it came out in April 2022. So it took about 2 years to get from the NOPR to the final rule. But I'll say these things don't happen in a vacuum. Even though the NOPR came out only 2 years ago, we've been talking about these issues as an industry for quite some time. There were proceedings in advance of the NOPR that discussed some of the items there. And then also FERC hosted something called technical conferences. And these are public conversations between commissioners and invited panelists that allow FERC to hear from a variety of perspectives on a variety of issues. And they cited all these technical conferences, all these advanced proceedings in the NOPR, or pardon me, in the final rule as helping inform their view of the NOPR. So there's a lot of process and procedure and a lot of stakeholder input that goes into issuing a final rule.
Okay. Order 1920 certainly appears poised to increase investment in the electric transmission grid. Is there anything FERC is doing to make sure those investments are as effective as possible?
Yeah, there are a couple of things. And I'll say just as a foundational general matter, when we plan for future transmission needs proactively and collaboratively, which is what Order 1920 requires, it's kind of a no-brainer that this is going to save money in the sense that we are optimizing transmission investment relative to a reactive approach, essentially waiting for something to break and then putting a Band-Aid on it. It makes far more sense to take these things we're seeing in the energy industry and addressing them proactively. And, speaking of optimization, there's this other notion in Order 1920 about what FERC is calling right-sized projects. So, as you can imagine, over time, transmission assets become old, they become obsolete, and there may be a situation when we need to replace them or rebuild them in kind. And so what Order 1920 does is it requires us to identify all those assets over the next 10 years that are coming to the end of their lives. And then it allows on a regional basis for planning to see whether there's a more efficient regional solution that can right-size these projects that are end of life. And the interesting thing that FERC did there is they offer what's called a right of first refusal. So while ITC would have the right to rebuild our assets that are at the end of life, that right of first refusal will then extend to whatever the new right-sized project is. And so what I'll say about that is it seems like FERC is observing that there's a need to optimize projects and there's a need to quickly develop projects, and they've seen ROFR as being a tool to help them do that. And FERC has also expressed interest in expanding ROFR in other ways. While they didn't do it in the final rule, they've expressed an interest in doing it in the future for things like jointly owned projects. And these are the projects that might have a joint ownership structure that could lower costs for customers. So kind of in total, what I'd say is that, there's a growing realization that rights of first refusal ensure timely transmission investment. They can go hand in hand with customer affordability. And when you look at a transmission owner, an operator like ITC, we have vast experience. We've been developing electric transmission for some time. We have strong relationships with our local communities. We have economies of scale, efficient supply chain practices, and all of that helps us keep costs down. And so we can take these capabilities, and to the extent customers are still nervous about cost management, there are efforts at FERC as well to ensure that all of those benefits of an incumbent transmission owner building, operating, maintaining transmission, that the customers are getting the benefits of that. And so I think those in tandem with this holistic future-looking planning really helps our customers make sure they're getting the most bang for their buck.
So what do you see are the challenges ahead as we continue to transition to electrification and renewable energy?
Thank you for the question. There is a lot going on in our industry right now, a huge transformation. And as you know, part of it is renewable energy. We have decarbonization goals, whether at the federal, state, or even at the utility level. And transmission has to be part of the conversation because as we move towards more renewables, those renewables have different operating characteristics. They're located in different places. Transmission is going to be needed to get those renewables connected and to make sure they operate with reliable characteristics. But I'd say in addition to the generation side, there's this huge transformation on the load side. For decades, demand growth has been relatively flat, but we're seeing demand increases due to electrification. And this is everything from automobiles to home appliances, onshoring of manufacturing. So after decades of offshoring, industrial policies are bringing companies back to the United States. And then we're seeing the proliferation of AI and data centers. And with this demand in electricity, the economy is also becoming increasingly dependent on that electricity being reliable on a 24/7 basis. And so in tandem with the generational transformation of both supply and demand, we've got to invest in the grid to make sure we can meet changing demands and to do so reliably, which is really a call to action. We've got to get started today on the transmission that's needed. And as I mentioned before too, this transmission investment isn't without cost. So part of the transmission build out also needs to be a focus on how to optimize those investments and to invest cost effectively. And I think Order 1920 is a key component to doing just that. And something to know is that when we build transmission, it takes about 7 to 10 years. And again, like I mentioned, a call to action. Like that's why we've got to get started today, because if we're looking at needs 20 years out into the future, we've got to get started relatively soon in building the transmission needed for those futures. And I'll say too that planning for the grid is only one part of the puzzle. We've also got to get the projects constructed. And there's been a lot of contention around siting for infrastructure siting. And so that's something as an industry we also need to keep our eye on, is that identifying the right infrastructure is only one part of the story, but actually getting it sited in a way that respects local communities and gets the infrastructure built is another component. I'll wrap up by mentioning reliability. So I said that with the transformation of the grid, we're becoming increasingly reliable on it. And ITC, we strive to maintain top quartile performance for all of our operating companies. And this is critical, right? Because this performance being in the top quartile means customers experience fewer outages. They have exceptional reliability, and that's something all customers today depend on.